sometimes trains and locomotives get a bad rap when it's not really deserved. On occasion, throughout history, there's been situations where someone will build a locomotive or a train set, whatever it may be, and people will decide, that's so terrible! We hate it! Based on circumstantial things or perhaps a teething issue that's worked out pretty fast. There's been plenty of times where some locomotives weren't given the chance they deserved because, well, someone decided they were bad before they really had a shot. These are 5 bad trains that really aren't. The 2000 and 2100 class rail cars. These were diesel multiple units, operated by the Adelaide rail network, down in Australia. And I admit they're a bit of a vanilla choice, because if you ask rail fans in Australia, these things are great! They love them! Fantastical! One of their favorites. But if you ask the State Transport Authority, they were You know, it's kind of one of those situations. But unlike the rest of this list, these diesel multiple units, which are nicknamed Jumbos due to their raised cabs, which reminded them of the hump on Boeing 747 jumbo jets, they did have a long career, lasting about 25 years. But at first glance, they definitely have an awkward appearance, again due to that raised cab. When I first saw them, I thought they looked weird as heck, but the more I looked, the more I'm like, you know, they don't really look bad. It's kind of one of those designs that really grows on you, in my opinion. Their body shell in general was based on the Bud SPV 2000s, and by extension the Bud Metroliner and the Amfleet cars. They look like Amtrak cars in a way, though their curve is slightly different. The 2000s were the power cars, and the 2100s were the trailer cars. And they were constructed between 1978 and 1980. And their odd cab, the reason for the raised cab thing, was not necessarily something the manufacturer Comenge wanted to do, but that was to meet union requirements. See, the Australian Federated Union of Locomotive Employees demanded that the new cars have a full-width driver's cab, but also allowing intercarriage doors to be fitted. Now, if you're thinking about that for a second, that's very counterintuitive. You can't have both, can you? Well, you can, but it requires that the cab be on a completely different level from the doors, so hence the cabs were raised. And it worked out because it gave them a distinctive appearance and gave pretty solid visibility for the drivers. These were diesel hydraulic designs, interestingly enough, and were originally powered by V12 turbocharged MAN D3650 engines. Though in the late 1980s they would be repowered with 2 turbocharged 6-cylinder Cummins engines, which drove a Voith hydraulic transmission. And they served pretty faithfully for many years, doing their job. But, according to the company, they never really were fit for purpose. See, they were designed for stop-start regional service, and in that role, they weren't really great at it. For one thing, the engines actually took up a tremendous amount of space inside the cab. About 1/3 of the cabin was taken up by the engine, so already that was a problem. And overall, they just weren't ideal for the role they found themselves in. But they quickly became a fan favorite. And, as it turned out, if you put them on some kind of express service, long distance, well, it turned out they were great for that. Drivers found them wonderful whenever they were able to really open the throttle and let them go. They were capable of reaching 81 miles per hour. And the drivers often let them do that whenever they were on the way to the shops for maintenance. So, yeah, the company wasn't a fan of them, but it was only because they didn't fill the niche properly. In terms of operability and other roles, they really weren't bad at all. And again, people loved them. Fortunately, 4 were preserved. 2006 and 2112 were given to the National Railway Museum in Port Adelaide, and 2010 and 2109 were given to the Steam Ranger Heritage Railway. Technically, 2009 and 2104 still exist, but they were donated to the South Australian Metropolitan Fire Service for use in training exercises. Because of that they're not really preserved in the traditional sense, since they're using for training with fire and water, and they're not going to last particularly long in that role, but they are serving an important need for training for, firefighters, so hey, there could be worse things. The rest of the family was sadly scrapped, but the 4 at the museums will likely stick around for quite a long time. The Pennsylvania Railroad Class DD2. DD2? The heck is a DD2? That's clearly a GG1, right? Well, no. But also yes. But also no. Let me explain this. The DD2 was directly based on the GG1 and was only a single prototype electric locomotive that never had any series production. She was an only child. The intention of the DD2 was to supplement the GG1. She was supposed to be an improved and simplified GG1, and her family was to run on the extension of the Pennsylvania's electrification network west of Harrisburg, PA. She was numbered 5800, and her design was a little interesting, because again, they were trying to simplify but also improve GG1s. GG1s are considered some of the best electric locomotives ever produced in America, so, alright, big shoes to fill, but in a way they did pull it off. Her wheel arrangement was 440 plus 044 in the white notation, or 2B plus B2 in AAR. She had 2 different frames that were hinged in the middle. Her drivers and motors were mounted directly to each of the frames with 2 pairs on either side. A swinging 4-wheeled unpowered truck was mounted to the outer end of each frame, and the bodywork swiveled on mounts on top of the frames. Thinking about that, you're probably like, isn't that exactly what the GG1 does? And yeah, pretty much. Except the GG1s had 6 driven axles. The DD2 only had 4. The reason for this is not only did that simplify maintenance, but also the DD2 was technically more powerful than the GG1 because she had newer motors. Weight on her drivers was 286,000 pounds, which is slightly less than the GG1's 300,000 pounds. But with the extra power, this basically amounted to the DD2 having slightly less tractive effort than the GG1. But I mean really slightly, like barely noticeable. Pretty much, they could do exactly the same jobs, except the DD2 was just a little bit simpler and easier to manage. But she never got any sisters. Why? If she was pretty much just as good as a GG1, but, easier to maintain, shouldn't she have been superior in that way? Cheaper to operate? And yeah, except the extension of the Penzies electrification system west of Harrisburg never happened. It was planned, but it never happened, so there was no need to replace the GG1s. It was more expensive to do. As a result, the DD2 never had any siblings, but they did keep her around because she was good. They just didn't wind up needing the work that she was intended for. Instead, 5800 spent most of her life working in the Baltimore Tunnel Helper Service, and sadly was not held for preservation, despite being a one-of-a-kind locomotive, being scrapped in September of 1962. It's a shame, because she wasn't bad, not at all. It's just where she was supposed to work never materialized. The Fairbanks-Morse P-12-42, which is nicknamed Speed Merchant, which is what I'm going to call it, because Fairbanks-Morse likes giving me really awkward designations to work with for their diesels. But yeah, Fairbanks-Morse, a diesel. A passenger diesel, huh? Oh, it's a car body. Okay, alright, that's neat. These were 1,200 horsepower locomotives built between 1957 and 1958, and they only ever produced 4 of them. They were intended to bring Fairbanks-Morse into the lightweight locomotive market, but in the end, they didn't at all. They only ever made 4 of them. I mean, it's not really doing so hot there, but not because of anything wrong with them. True to Fairbanks-Morse's reputation, these used opposed piston diesel engines, an 8-cylinder one in their case rated at 1,600 horsepower. And you might be saying, wait a minute, I thought you said these were 1,200 horsepower. Well, yes, that's because for the lights and everything that goes along with the pulling of a passenger train, they needed to draw power from the diesel engine, and the design called for 25% of the power being used for that, meaning that there was only 1,200 left for traction. But that worked fine, because they were passenger locomotives, and passenger trains are usually lighter than freight trains. They did okay. And there were technically two different versions of them. One was constructed for the Boston and Maine Railroad, and that was a pure diesel design, and the one directly called Speed Merchant. The other version went to New Haven, and that was a hybrid, dual-powered locomotive, which was equipped with a third rail pickup, allowing them to operate in New York's Grand Central Terminal without throwing diesel exhaust all over the place. The thing is, Fairbanks-Morse seems to have done a pretty good job with these, and they fully expected to get more orders from New Haven because once they saw how great they were, surely they'd order more, right? Well, yes, on paper, they should have. However, they completely and woefully underestimated just how friggin' bad New Haven's financial situation was at the time. They had no money at all. And neither did Fairbanks-Morse when it came to making locomotives. That meant they couldn't offer any financing for the purchase of their products. Railroads had to pay for them out of pocket, and New Haven just flat out couldn't afford it. There was just no way. But over on the EMD side, which were owned by General Motors, they could easily afford to provide financing, meaning that New Haven pretty much had no choice but to order a fleet of 60 FL9s from EMD instead, rather than get any more of the P-12-42s. It's a shame, because it seems like Fairbanks-Morse did a really good job with them. But when your only customer literally can't afford them because they need to take out the line of credit, and you can't give it to them, well, it ain't the locomotive's fault. It absolutely was not their fault. And yes, all of these relatively unique locomotives were scrapped. The Lima-Hamilton 2,500 horsepower transfer locomotive, name that rolls right off the tongue, also designated the A-3177. Not helping. Also known as the LT-2500. Lima, you're killing me. Okay, whatever. This diesel-electric was the very final locomotive model produced by Lima-Hamilton before the company merged with Baldwin in September of 1951, which formed Baldwin, Lima, and Hamilton Corporation, or BLH. These basically represented Lima's final attempt to get back into the locomotive market in the form of diesels, and they produced a total of 22 of them. Thing is, Lima was probably on the right track. The 3177s actually proved to be really good. Odd, with that centered cab, which made visibility a little bit questionable, but in terms of reliability and function, their only customer, the Pennsylvania Railroad, was very happy with them. All 22 of these diesels went to the Pennsy, and those models lasted till 1967. Thing is, they might have helped save Lima if they had not merged with Baldwin, because after getting those initial 22, the Pennsy wanted 22 more. They wanted a total of 44 of the things. Like, wait, whoa, you guys are making something good here. Pennsylvania Railroad wants more of them. So what happened? Couldn't they just make more under Baldwin? And okay, they could have, but Baldwin's brass decided not to let them. In order to standardize their catalog, they decided only to focus on Baldwin-made diesel designs and completely get rid of Lima's. As a result, they still made a sale to the Pennsylvania Railroad, but sent them the Baldwin RT624s instead, which are basically just an improved version of the Baldwin DT66 2000s. Very similar in design, and they were alright, but it's just kind of frustrating that people often assume that Lima was making bad diesels when no. These were pretty good. So good that the Pennsylvania Railroad wanted more of them. It was just that after they merged, Baldwin wouldn't make any more of Lima's designs. That was the only reason we didn't see any more. And yes, all of them were scrapped. I don't know what you expected. The Advanced Passenger Train, or the APT. Hello, old friend! Oh, how I've not missed you, but here we are. Good buddy. Old pal. What have you done? Well, I have talked about this a couple times before, but I'm bringing it up now, because frankly, in the past, I have fallen into the trap that a lot of people do with this thing, and, well, I put it on my list of worst trains ever. It really doesn't deserve that. Not at all. The APT was a project with so much potential that was completely screwed up. Not because the final product was even bad, but because of a media circus slamming it, woeful government mismanagement, and just a ridiculous protracted development cycle, also because of the mismanagement thing. Now, whenever someone mentions the APT, technically they are talking about two different things, so it's important to clarify what we're referring to. There were two different versions, the experimental edition, APT-E, and the prototype, otherwise known as the British Rail Class 370, or APT-P. They never made a production version of the APT, and the intention behind the entire project, regardless of which version we're referring to, was to create a modern, high-speed passenger train that did not require them to completely reorient their entire rail network to accommodate it. The problem with the UK was running into was that Japan had proved that trains could compete with planes, and France was also working on the same thing. The thing about high-speed rail, though, is it requires some extra room and special engineering in order to make it safe. The lines have to be pretty sturdy, without a lot of tight corners. Problem was, the UK didn't really have a lot of room to work with when it came to building new lines, because they were already saturated with lines anyway. They had gotten rid of some, thanks to beaching, but they still had a lot, and certainly not enough room to make a high-speed network. So what were they going to do? Well, their plan was actually to, instead of making the railroad work for the locomotive, make the locomotive work for the rail. Basically, a tilt train. This would change the physics a bit. If the train leaned into the turns, it could go a lot faster, in theory, compared to a regular train, without the need to re-engineer the entire network. It was a novel idea, very modern, very ambitious, and very innovative, and the first version was the experimental unit sets, and they were constructed between 1977 and 1980, entering service in 1979. But that was probably a bit too soon. Just a little bit. Just a little bit. See, the development of the APT overall was plagued with problems, mostly because they, were doing something brand new as far as they were concerned, and were innovating, but there were a lot of issues to iron out, and management started infighting. Some argued that it was too large of a step to make in one go, and they should do something smaller and less ambitious. That smaller, less ambitious project was the HST, or the Intercity 125, which used two Class 43 diesel locomotives. Those turned out to be very successful, true. However, because of this schism in design ethos and two different projects going on at the same time, British Rail's board of directors decided to make drastic cuts to the APT project overall, reducing the total number of trains to be built in the end to just 4, and then that was later cut down to 3 by the government in 1974 as a result of further budget cuts. The gears were starting to grind against the APT project before it was even finished. And then another restructuring within British Rail caused the APT project to, no longer have a dedicated team. Instead, multiple different segments were the responsibility of multiple different teams, which meant that fixing problems in communication was at an all-time low. All this compounded to cause delays, meaning that the APT didn't enter service till it was quite a bit late. When it finally got there, the press had already been making fun of it because of the protracted development cycle, and then when they were invited to ride it, they decided to say that it caused them motion sickness, referring to it as a queasy rider, because of the tilt thing. However, despite also falling into this rumor about the APT myself, I'm here to correct y'all. See, the actual reason the press was sick was, not necessarily because of the tilt thing. It was because they had been drinking heavily because British Rail gave them free alcohol on the trip. So, you know, there are things here that there's some personal responsibility that no one's talking about. I think we should bring it up. Granted, the APT still did have problems. British Rail had rushed it into service because there were threats to cancel the whole thing, even though they were technically almost done. The rushing did mean that there were certain flaws. One of the sets got stuck in a tilt, which, great. And despite the fact that the trains that were supposed to run smoothly, well, they just weren't doing that. They had to recall them and continue efforts, and they weren't reintroduced until mid-1984. Though they didn't actually advertise it because they were terrified of the press slamming them again for no reason. This time the trains actually worked really well, though. Like, they were really good by then. All the problems were pretty much fixed. But because of the absolute disaster of a development cycle, there was no hope of getting any further funding to build the production version. By then, the HST was also in service and had been performing phenomenally without the need for any kind of tilting mechanism. And in the end, even in their fixed condition, they didn't last particularly long and were quietly withdrawn. Fortunately, they weren't all scrapped though. The experimental had already been sent to a museum, the National Railway Museum, and is still on display at the Locomotion Museum at Shildon in County Durham. One of the prototype units is on display at the Crew Heritage Center, and one of the prototype powered cars, number 49006, is at the Electric Railway Museum near Coventry. The story of the APT is frankly nothing short of tragic. It was a good idea, a really neat concept that really could have worked, but to an obnoxious amount of mismanagement, which resulted in delay after delay after delay, and the press deciding to get really, really drunk and slamming it without ever giving it a fair chance. Well, it never had a fair chance. Ever. And that makes people wonder, had it been handled properly, what might have been in the grand scheme of things. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.